the late 18th century, a single, unassuming plant completely rewired the global economy. It was not a rare spice, a precious metal, or a devastating weapon. It was a simple, fluffy white fiber growing on a bush. Yet the insatiable human hunger for this exact crop would build the very first modern factories, ignite the bloodiest conflict in American history, and ruthlessly birth the modern industrialized world. This is the true, terrifying, and monumental history of cotton. Long before the suffocating smoke of the Industrial Revolution ever darkened the skies of Europe, the Gossypium plant existed as a profound biological anomaly. Unlike silk, which was an exclusive, highly protected secret hoarded by a single empire in the East, cotton was a global phenomenon from the very beginning. By a strange twist of evolutionary fate, different species of this plant grew wildly and independently across completely disconnected continents. Ancient civilizations in the Indus River Valley, the coastal deserts of Peru, and the upper reaches of the Nile all discovered the miraculous properties of this plant thousands of years apart, without ever communicating with one another. When the tightly packed green bolls of the cotton plant reached maturity, they would burst open, revealing a dense, protective cloud of white cellulose fibers designed by nature to catch the wind and scatter the plant's seeds. The ancient humans realized that if they gathered these fluffy bolls, pulled the fibers apart, and twisted them together, they could spin a yarn that was incredibly breathable, highly absorbent, and far more comfortable against the skin than rough animal wool or stiff linen. But there was a brutal, physically exhausting catch. Hidden deep inside that soft, fluffy white cloud were dozens of small, hard, incredibly sticky seeds. The cotton fibers clung to these seeds with a desperate grip. Before a single thread could be spun, every individual seed had to be painstakingly pulled out of the fiber by hand. It was agonizingly slow, tedious labor. A skilled worker could spend an entire day tearing their fingers up just to clean a single pound of usable cotton. Because of this massive biological bottleneck, for most of human history, cotton was not a global commodity. It was a localized luxury. It was simply too difficult and too expensive to process on a massive scale. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, cotton was so rare and mysterious that people fundamentally misunderstood what it even was. Similar to the myths surrounding silk, European scholars who had never seen a cotton plant drew absurd, terrifying illustrations of the vegetable lamb of Tartary, a mythical creature where real living sheep grew out of the ground on the stalks of plants, bending down to eat the grass around them before being harvested for their fleece. The Europeans relied on heavy wool and coarse flax. They desired the lightweight, brilliantly dyed cotton calicos that slowly trickled in through trade routes from India, but they could not afford them, nor could they produce them. The true turning point in human history, the spark that would ignite the modern world, did not happen in a cotton field. It happened in the damp, rainy island of Great Britain in the 1700s, driven by an intense, overwhelming desire to cut out the middlemen of the East. British inventors and tinkerers, desperate to mass-produce cheap textiles to compete with Indian imports, began building massive, complex wooden machines. In 1764, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, a machine that allowed a single worker to spin 8 threads at once. Shortly after, Richard Arkwright developed the water frame, harnessing the terrifying power of rushing rivers to spin incredibly strong cotton yarn automatically. Suddenly, the production of textiles was no longer happening in the quiet, dim living rooms of individual weavers. It was moved into massive, towering brick buildings filled with deafening, dangerous machinery. The factory system had been born. But this explosive leap in British engineering created a terrifying new problem. The massive new factories, soon powered by coal-burning steam engines, were completely insatiable. The iron gears spun so fast that they were devouring raw cotton at a rate the world had never seen. The British Empire desperately needed an ocean of raw, white cotton to feed its roaring machines. But the world simply could not clean the seeds out of the plant fast enough to supply them. The Industrial Revolution was on the verge of starving to death. The solution to this global crisis came in 1793 across the Atlantic Ocean, and it would curse the trajectory of human history. The solution to this global crisis came in 1793 across the Atlantic Ocean, and it would curse the trajectory of human history. A young American inventor named Eli Whitney had traveled to the state of Georgia to work as a tutor on a plantation. While observing the enslaved laborers agonizingly separating the sticky seeds from the cotton fibers by hand, Whitney realized the mechanical inefficiency of the process. Within weeks, he engineered a deceptively simple device. It was a wooden box equipped with a hand crank, a rotating cylinder lined with wire teeth, and a series of brushes. As the crank turned, the wire teeth pulled the raw cotton through narrow slits in a metal grate. The slits were perfectly sized to let the soft cotton pass through, but they were too small for the hard seeds. The seeds were violently ripped from the fiber and dropped away. He called it the cotton gin. The mathematical impact of this simple wooden box is almost impossible to overstate. A highly skilled worker separating seeds by hand could produce roughly 1 pound of clean cotton in an entire day. A single person operating a hand-cranked cotton gin could clean 50 pounds in a day. When planters hooked larger versions of the machine to water wheels or later to steam engines, they could clean thousands of pounds of cotton in a matter of hours. The biological bottleneck that had restricted the cotton plant for millennia was instantly, permanently shattered. But there was a terrifying, deeply tragic irony to Eli Whitney's invention. Whitney had naively hoped that by mechanizing the hardest part of the work, he would reduce the need for enslaved labor. Instead, he unleashed an economic monster. Suddenly, because the cotton could be cleaned instantly, the profitability of the crop skyrocketed. Southern planters realized that if they could clean millions of pounds of cotton, the only thing stopping them from achieving godlike wealth was their ability to grow and pick it. To feed the screaming, hungry machines in Britain, the American planters needed two things: infinite land and infinite labor. What followed was one of the most rapid, aggressive, and brutal economic expansions in human history. To secure the land, the United States government initiated a ruthless campaign of ethnic cleansing. Throughout the 1830s, hundreds of thousands of indigenous people from the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations were violently forced off their ancestral lands in the Deep South by the federal military. This horrific forced march, known as the Trail of Tears, emptied millions of acres of incredibly fertile, nutrient-rich soil spanning from Georgia to Texas. The land was immediately swallowed up by land speculators and plantation owners. But the cotton plants still had to be planted, tended, and hand-picked. It required a massive disposable workforce. The cotton gin did not end slavery. It supercharged it into a hyper-capitalist, militarized industrial system. Before the cotton gin, slavery in the United States was actually in a slow, steady decline. Tobacco, the previous cash crop, had exhausted the soil of the Upper South, and many founding fathers believed the institution of slavery would naturally die out. But the explosion of the global cotton trade changed the math. The price of an enslaved human being tripled. An internal domestic slave trade exploded across the American continent. Over 1 million enslaved men, women, and children were forcibly marched from the upper states like Virginia and Maryland down into the brutal, disease-ridden cotton fields of the Deep South. They were sold on auction blocks like livestock, their bodies legally used as financial collateral to secure massive bank loans. The cotton plantation of the 19th century was not a traditional farm, it was a factory in the field. It was governed by a terrifyingly modern system of spreadsheets, quotas, and extreme physical violence. Every enslaved person was assigned a daily picking weight. Overseers stood in the fields with scales and whips. If a picker fell short of their specific weight quota by even a few ounces, the punishment was exact, calculated, and brutal. This was known as the pushing system, designed to constantly terrorize the labor force into picking faster and faster with every passing season. By the 1840s, the Deep South had transformed into an absolute global monopoly. They were producing roughly 75% of the entire world's supply of raw cotton. And all of it was flowing across the Atlantic Ocean to feed the heart of the British Empire. The umbilical cord between the brutalized, enslaved pickers in Mississippi and the wage-slaving factory workers in Manchester formed the absolute foundation of the modern global economy. Entire fleets of massive wooden sailing ships were built solely to carry this white gold. When the cotton arrived in the port of Liverpool, it fueled an industrial explosion. But the conditions inside the British textile mills were their own kind of nightmare. Men, women, and thousands of young children worked 14-hour shifts in deafening, suffocating brick factories. The windows were permanently nailed shut to keep the humidity high, so the cotton threads wouldn't snap. The air inside the mills was so thick with microscopic white cotton fibers that it looked like it was snowing indoors. The workers inhaled this dust constantly, leading to a deadly, incurable lung disease known as byssinosis, or brown lung, which slowly suffocated them to death. Human life was cheap. The cotton was all that mattered. The wealth generated by this transatlantic loop of suffering was staggering. It wasn't just the southern plantation owners and the British factory barons who became incomprehensibly rich. The modern financial system was built on the back of the cotton trade. The massive banks on Wall Street in New York, the elite insurance firms in the City of London, the shipping magnates of New England, all of them were deeply entangled in the business of white gold. Northern banks issued mortgages on enslaved humans. London insurance companies wrote policies protecting the slave ships and the cargo. The capital generated by cotton was poured into the creation of the first modern railroads, the telegraph lines, and the steel mills. Cotton was the crude oil of the 19th century. This absolute economic dominance bred a dangerous, intoxicating arrogance among the Southern political elite. By 1860, cotton accounted for nearly 60% of all United States exports. The plantation owners looked at the map of the world and realized that the most powerful empire on earth, Great Britain, was entirely dependent on their crop to survive. Millions of British jobs and the stability of the British Crown itself relied on the continuous flow of American cotton. A South Carolina senator famously stood in the halls of Congress and declared, "You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." They genuinely believed that their monopoly made them untouchable. They believed that if anyone tried to interfere with their slave-driven empire, they could simply shut off the flow of cotton, deliberately crash the global economy, and force the world to come to their rescue. In 1861, they decided to test that theory. The southern states seceded from the Union, triggering the American Civil War. The global economy was about to experience its very first catastrophic worldwide crash. The supply of white gold was about to be cut off. When the first shots of the American Civil War echoed across Fort Sumter in 1861, the Southern Confederacy enacted their grand, arrogant strategy. They proudly initiated a self-imposed embargo. They intentionally burned over 2.5 million bales of their own cotton, a staggering fortune, specifically to starve the British textile mills and force the British military to intervene in the war on the side of the South. President Abraham Lincoln retaliated with the Anaconda Plan, a massive, suffocating naval blockade of the entire southern coastline, ensuring that not a single ounce of white gold could leave the continent. The global shockwave was immediate and devastating. Across the Atlantic, in the massive industrial heartland of Lancashire, England, the machines ground to a halt. The deafening roar of the mills was replaced by a terrifying, starving silence. This period became known as the Lancashire Cotton Famine. Hundreds of thousands of British mill workers were thrown into the streets, facing absolute starvation and freezing winters without income. The southern planters eagerly waited for the British Empire to crack under the economic pressure and send their invincible navy to smash Lincoln's blockade. But history took a profound, unexpected turn. Despite facing starvation, the British working class, many of whom were deeply opposed to human bondage, refused to support the Confederacy. In a legendary act of solidarity, the starving mill workers of Manchester actually wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln, declaring that they would rather suffer than see the continuation of slavery. The British government, realizing the political toxicity of joining a war to defend slavery, refused to intervene. But the roaring machines of the empire still demanded to be fed. If they could not get their cotton from the American South, the British Empire would simply rip it from the soil of the rest of the world. In a frantic panic, British capital flooded into completely new territories, aggressively transforming the agricultural landscapes of entire nations to secure a new supply. Their primary targets were India and Egypt. In Egypt, the ruler Ismail Pasha saw the skyrocketing price of cotton as a golden ticket to modernize his country. He borrowed astronomical sums of money from European banks to build massive irrigation canals, railroads, and ports, turning the fertile Nile River delta into a massive cotton plantation. For a few years, Egypt experienced an unimaginable economic boom. But it was a deadly, carefully laid financial trap. When the American Civil War ended in 1865 and the newly freed American laborers returned to the fields under the oppressive system of sharecropping, American cotton suddenly flooded back into the global market. The price of the fiber crashed overnight. Egypt's economy collapsed. Unable to pay the crushing interest on the loans they had taken to build their cotton infrastructure, the Egyptian government went entirely bankrupt. To settle the debt, the British Empire stepped in and took physical control of the country, seizing the newly built Suez Canal and occupying Egypt with military force for the next 70 years. A similar tragedy unfolded in India. For centuries, India had been the world's most masterful producer of finished, beautifully woven luxury cotton textiles. But the British Empire did not want Indian textiles. They wanted cheap, raw Indian cotton to feed the machines in Manchester. Through ruthless colonial policies and crushing taxes, the British systematically dismantled the ancient Indian textile industry. Master weavers were forced into brutal poverty, and millions of Indian farmers were coerced into abandoning their food crops to grow raw, cash-cropped cotton for export. The British then took that raw cotton, spun it in their steam-powered mills, and sold the cheap, finished fabric back to the very Indian people they had impoverished. It was the ultimate, terrifying realization of the industrial colonial machine. The pursuit of the white fiber had completely redrawn the geopolitical map of the world. As the 20th century dawned, the horrific human cost of cotton began to transition into a devastating environmental cost. Cotton is a notoriously thirsty and delicate plant. It is highly susceptible to pests, particularly the devastating boll weevil, and it drains the soil of nutrients with terrifying speed. To maintain the impossibly high yields demanded by the modern global economy, the agricultural industry turned to chemistry. Cotton rapidly became the most chemically intensive crop on the face of the planet. Today, while cotton occupies only about 2.5% of the world's agricultural land, it consumes nearly 16% of all global insecticides and 7% of all pesticides. But the most horrifying demonstration of cotton's insatiable thirst occurred in the heart of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Determined to become entirely self-sufficient in cotton production, Soviet engineers initiated a massive, arrogant geopolitical project in the 1960s. They decided to grow millions of acres of cotton in the middle of the arid deserts of Central Asia, in modern-day Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. To water this impossible desert plantation, they built a massive network of unlined canals aggressively diverting the flow of the two massive rivers that fed the Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake on planet Earth. The cotton bloomed in the desert, but the cost was apocalyptic. Deprived of its water source, the Aral Sea simply began to evaporate. Over the next few decades, the massive inland sea shrank to less than 10% of its original size. Thriving fishing communities were left stranded in a toxic, dusty wasteland dozens of miles from the vanishing shoreline. The massive amounts of chemical pesticides and fertilizers used on the cotton fields had washed into the dying sea. When the water evaporated, it left behind a thick crust of toxic, cancerous salt. Today, massive, toxic dust storms whip across the dry seabed, carrying the deadly chemicals into the lungs of the local population, causing catastrophic rates of cancer, respiratory disease, and infant mortality. The United Nations has called the drying of the Aral Sea one of the most staggering environmental disasters in human history. All of it simply to grow a softer fiber. Today, we are completely blind to the terrifying gravity of this plant. You are likely wearing it right now. It is in the denim of our jeans, the crisp sheets on our beds, the currency in our wallets, and the medical gauze in our hospitals. It is the fabric of our lives. It feels innocent. It feels soft. But if you pull a single, microscopic thread from the hem of your shirt and trace it backward through the centuries, you will not find innocence. You will find the deafening roar of the very first steam engines. You will find the agonizing, bloody tears of millions of enslaved humans sold on auction blocks. You will find the bankruptcies of ancient empires, the colonization of continents, and the toxic dry beds of evaporated seas. No other plant in the history of the earth has been so deeply watered with human blood, and no other crop has so aggressively, ruthlessly built the modern industrialized world. It is the white gold that conquered humanity. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden, terrifying forces that shaped our world, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of the cotton story shocked you the most. And make sure to like this video so more people can uncover the dark, undeniable truth hidden inside the fabric of history.